It's very easy to look at the medieval period through the lens of the culture we come from, and I'm very guilty of that. I look at English sources all the time. Today's guest, Dr Rachel Schine, is writing about a completely different set of sources, particularly the epic poems of the Islamic world during the Middle Ages. And some of these epic poems predate the rise of Islam as well, which is really fascinating. This gives a really interesting alternate view of a time we might think we know quite well. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Welcome everybody to Future Imperfect. I have a really interesting guest here today. Rachel, would you introduce yourself, please, and what it is we're going to talk about? Because I think it's got some really interesting echoes for the medieval scholars that might be listening.
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Rachel Schine. I'm a professor of Arabic and history at the University of Maryland, College Park. And my primary background is in Islamic cultural studies. So today we're going to be talking about my recent book, Black Knights, Arabic Epic and the Making of Medieval Race, which is sort of a history from below of how folk cultures throughout the pre-modern Middle East and North Africa understood the interaction between people we would consider basically of sub-Saharan African heritage and themselves throughout medieval history and in heroic and militarized contexts.
So I guess I can start by apologizing for not knowing much about the Islamic world in the medieval period. It's an area I think that sheds quite an interesting light on my area of, not expertise, my area of interest, which is the sort of Western idea of a knight in history. And of course, I presume we do have quite a lot of records from the time that are, not written by the Franks, as I believe they were known, but written by the enemies of the Franks, and in some cases, trading partners, I guess. So where is all this information and how can we study it?
Absolutely. So the information about the Franks specifically, or the people who were known as Ifranj in the Arabic language, really emerges as a product, as you could probably imagine, in terms of mass accounts and resources from the crusading period. So between the 1090s and the 1290s, essentially, in records that existed in the form of everything from royal court chronicles, essentially, to the diaristic accounts of people like Osama bin Munqidh, who was a sort of prince in Shaizar under the Zengid dynasty. Paul Cobb has done a translation of his Book of Contemplation, where he gives account of his experiences of interacting with people in the crusading kingdoms that were established after the First Crusade, for example. My sources that I'm concerned with date to around the same period. The epics, or sir sha'abiyya, these popular, long-form, half-oral, half-written stories that people told, are first attested in an autobiography that was written by a Jewish convert to Islam in the 12th century. But almost all of the texts that I look at in the book actually reflect on a much earlier set of conquest dynamics that have little to do with the Franks and much more to do with Arum, the Byzantines, as well as the people of Fars, or Persia, at the time the Sasanians, in the sense that they're primarily concerned with the early Islamic expansions and migrations outward from the Arabian Peninsula into various corners of what become the Mamalik al-Islam, the Islamic world. So those places that are explicitly under, ultimately, Muslim authority and responsibility, and therefore not really concerned so much with what's going on in so-called Frankish lands.
Okay, so these stories really have their roots in the Byzantines being the enemy. Is that right? Is that how one could simplify it?
Yeah, so that is, for the particular epic that my book is on, the exact crux of it. So the longest epic in the Arabic language is known by two titles. One is Sirat al-Amira Dat al-Himma, the tale of the princess or general whose nom de guerre meant possessor of ambition. And the other title is just Sirat al-Mujahideen, the tale of the pious warriors. When I say it's the longest epic in the Arabic language, what I mean is that in modern textual versions of it, it comes to about 5,000 pages.
5,000 pages of historical documents.
5,000 pages.
That's probably more than we've got for the whole of centuries in England of the period.
Right. And historical documentation is a bit of a funny phrase because it's storytelling. It's sort of fictive. It's imaginative. But it is imagining in a reconstructing, recreating way, the Arabo-Byzantine conflicts of the 7th through 9th centuries. Not every single one of the epics is like that. For example, one of the most famous epics is about actually a pre-Islamic warrior named Antara ibn Shaddad, who was a poet and born into enslavement to an Abyssinian mother but an Arab father in the tribe of Abs prior to the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. And his is kind of a perfect encapsulation of how these epics are used to sort of prefigure or recreate aspects of the glorious Islamic past, in the sense that he's not just tangling with Arum, the Byzantines, he's tangling with the sort of trifecta of kingdoms that encased the Arabian Peninsula before the rise of Islam. So you have the Byzantines in the northwest, you have the Sasanians in the northeast, and then you also have Aksum, the Abyssinian kingdom, to the southwest in East Africa.
So an major African kingdom.
Major African kingdom, yeah.
So, and how would we describe in modern terms the skin color of the people from those different areas? Because I think that's very useful for people to understand, because we're going to talk a little bit about race and that kind of stuff. So I guess it's complicated is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what we think of today, when we think of where Aksum would have been, we're thinking parts of what is now Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Eastern Sudan, and Northwestern Somalia. So basically Horn of Africa, up to where you start seeing clear relationships, of course, with the Southern Arabian Peninsula, because they share a strait, Bab el-Mandeb, and Yemen is just 18 miles away across that strait, basically. So there are two questions you then have to ask. One is, what do I think of when I think of, as a contemporary person, East Africans, in terms of appearance and in terms of how they might have appeared to other people at the time? And second of all is, what do I think of when I think of Yemen, and how different really do South Arabians see themselves, for example, from these people who are right across the strait? Chances are, in terms of just melanation, in terms of skin tone, there's not actually that big of a difference. At the same time, though, this figure, Antara ibn Shaddad, who was born to the tribe of Abs is up in central Arabia, first of all. And second of all, by the time that he's vaunted into this sort of afterlife as a major hero in a folk epic in the Islamic period, well after his life in the 6th century, he is explicitly being known as somebody who is Aswad, somebody who is black. So that term has taken on meaning and significance and indicates a variety of people, not just from places like Abyssinia, but from a sort of geographic formation that you start seeing attested in the Abbasid period, so in the 9th and 10th century geographic traditions in the Islamic world, called the Bilad al-Sudan, lands where there are black people, or lands of black people.
And by black people, do you mean people with dark brown skin?
Yeah, so I kind of mean two things. And the reason that I'm saying that is because there's sort of the common sense of what blackness is that you or I still have today, where it's like, yeah, that means somebody with dark skin that passes a certain threshold. But there's also a genealogical understanding of what blackness is in the Islamic world, and I'll explain that in a second. So the Bilad al-Sudan, in terms of geographic formation, basically encapsulate parts of the Sahel, so the edge of the Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, but also parts of the world's general south, including places like Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, and sometimes even parts of Sindh and Hind, so what is now India and Pakistan, which is because of basically the fact that Muslim geographers inherit their scheme for how the world looks from Greek authors like Herodotus and Ptolemy. And in the Greek tradition, there was this concept of the climes, aqalim in Arabic, so they take the word directly. And these climes were broad latitudinal formations that in the world's far south had different air, water, and weather than in the world's far north.
Right.
And Aristotle likens this to baking bread. So Aristotle says, okay, I'm a Greek dude. I'm in the middle clime. The middle clime is the happy medium. He loved a happy medium. And so the weather is more temperate. I have nice olive skin. I'm neither overcooked nor undercooked, like a perfect loaf of bread. And if you go further north, you kind of get Pillsbury Doughboy. You become a lot fairer. Your hair is lank. Your eyes are blue.
Didn't they even call them blonde, which doesn't mean very light hair, but it means not dark hair, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you go to the far south, then the exact opposite occurs. So this was the sort of erudite explanation for these types of human difference that produce ultimately blackness in the world's far south. And this is why it redounds to not just parts of Africa, but also parts of South Asia, for example.
It sounds like they're just describing it in terms of cooking, when undercooked, perfectly done, and overcooked.
Mm-hmm.
Did it come with any other kind of societal baggage, or was it just an observation of skin color at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So because of the understanding of the relationship between the climate and one's humors, as the things that produce these bodily differences, there was an understanding that the interior and the exterior had a relationship. So the reason, in other words, that you're becoming black or overcooked, quote unquote, is because the extremes of the weather imbalance your humors, which are your blood, your yellow bile, your black bile, and your phlegm that are produced by different organs of your body, and in an ideal concoction, make a healthy, sort of happy medium individual once again.
Presumably, that would be like the Greeks. That's how they would.
Like the Greeks, or later like the Arabs, yeah.
Yeah.
When they adopt this, it's funny how it always works to the advantage of the person who's doing the documenting. um, but that also therefore means that at the extremes of the world, you have extremes not only of exterior difference but also of interior difference. So if you were in places that were extremely hot and dry, like sub-Saharan Africa, it was considered that you would have sort of your mind be warped by those forces. And vice versa with people in the far north. So the Slavs, for example, or the Tatars were said to also have these effects in the opposite direction.
So as always, it's whoever's writing it thinks their own little world is perfect, and everybody away from it, foreigners, whatever they might be, are somehow different in a bad way compared to them.
Yeah.
Nothing changes.
Yeah, basically.
So just going back to it, so the period you're talking about maps across to what we would used to call the Dark Ages-ish in England, which is the area that I study in particular.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons for that is the paucity of written information, although there's been more recently found, and arguably the term Dark Ages is wrong. I presume there's quite a lot of information to go on then, so you definitely couldn't call it the Dark Ages in this part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you note, different sectors of area have a different way of marking time. Historians of Western Europe, I understand that Dark Ages has gone out of vogue.
I still think it's quite poetic. I think it's quite poetic. And I feel that, yes, it's pejorative and et cetera. But, a big empire went away from England in particular, and therefore things changed dramatically. So I kind of cut them some slack. But yeah, depends who I'm talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so there's no such sort of contrivance, basically, around the question of documentation in the Islamic world in terms of how historians periodize it, mostly because, as you said before, we have such a wealth of sources. Now, granted, that wealth of sources does have its own timeline in the sense that for the Abbasid period, so from the 750s basically till the 1250s when the Mongols sack Baghdad, you have this one dynasty of varying degrees of centralization, but that one dynasty ends up having a ton of sources produced from very early on because they correlate with the advent of paper-making technology in the Middle East in the 8th century. So once you get paper, and paper's cheaper and easier than parchment, you get many more sources. But even before then, you have writing. You have writing on parchment, you have writing on papyrus from the earliest Islamic period. The quote-unquote dark age, if you really want to apply that term somewhere, would be for what the Muslims refer to typically as the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance prior to the coming of Islam. And that's because of a combination of factors, one of which being sort of curated information loss. What do Muslims want to keep from that prior time period? But the other being, this sort of dearth of documentation because of an emphasis on oral culture, because of pastoral nomadism in the Arabian Peninsula, and because people are now finding ways of discovering sources in the region archaeologically that we just didn't have access to before, and neither did our predecessors.
I sometimes find it fascinating to think that something as simple as paper manufacture has such huge ramifications for what we know about, it's fairly prosaic. It's like paper. What does it mean? Well, it means everything. It means everything for the preservation and recording, because suddenly people can write cheaply and record things, and then a proportion of whatever was created still exists. But back to this heroic, because your book's called Black Knight. So was there a kind of category of fighting person that was sort of noble, and did they follow the equivalent of a chivalric code in the same sort of way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So knight is my translation of an Arabic term forsen, which literally means horseman, so has the same exact resonance as somebody who is doing chivalry in the sense that was chevalier, the horseman. The ideals of warriorship are a little bit different, and they're not scripted into a code so overtly, but rather have a few primary models that get iterated out in the early Islamic period. One of which is the idealization of a warrior who is willing to go to the frontier. What I mean by that is in the early Islamic period, people really emphasize strongly the importance of people who are muhajirun, migrants or emigrants. And that is considered a modality, basically, of idealized warriorship. So you might have heard of the concept of the Islamic calendar as being the Hijri calendar, the Hijri dating system. And that's basically because in the year 622, Muhammad, the prophet who's central to Islam, takes his early followers from the city of Mecca to the city that we now know as Medina, from Medina Munawwara, the enlightened or luminous city, but was then called Yathrib, about 200 miles to the north. And he does this in order to consolidate his community, to remove them from the oppressive environment of Mecca, and so on and so forth. And so when people think Hijra in Islamic tradition, they often think, oh, that's the Hijra, like just that one. But almost all of the early conquest migrations to places like Fustat in what is now Cairo, or Kufa and Basra in what is now southern Iraq, to set up these garrison cities that were the places that were the frontier of the conquest after Muhammad's death, were also referred to as enacting Hijra. So point number one is that if you're a warrior, you want to be on the move. Point number two is that if you're on the frontier, you're not living a particularly luxurious existence. So the valorization of asceticism, or being a zahid, was another key component of a lot of early Islamic literature on warriorship. The idea that you're renouncing at some level material goods in the material world in order to focus on the hereafter, or the sort of, forest rather than the trees in terms of your pietistic movement, and why are you going to the frontier? And both of those ideals, one being a frontier warrior who is willing to move into those spaces, and two being an ascetic or a pious individual within them, are very much promoted by the epics that I look at, which is to say that this is an ideal that's being sort of promoted by this literature.
So in a way, if we to take this down to sort of the fantasy archetype, you've got a kind of wandering paladin in a way. That, you've got somebody who's driven by religious component and is on the frontier, or maybe even a sort of a ranger type protecting the frontier. That's really interesting how it maps across. I don't think there's an equivalent of frontier as a concept in Western knighthood. So that's a really interesting kind of difference. Is that because the politics of the time were to sort of drive people to expand the land that was owned and controlled? Was that part of the subtext, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. There is definitely an expansionist outlook in these texts. And it's not just a matter of geographic expansion, it's also implicitly a matter of religious expansion. Of as you go to these places, you're going to be proselytizing, you're going to be seeking new followers at these frontiers. So it's not really sort of a settler movement or something like that, which is, I think, something that you might imagine is implied here, but rather the understanding was for the early people making these hijras to the Amsar, to the garrison cities, that you would be a small minority ruling over a largely unconverted majority, enacting, on the one hand, a paragon of Muslim governance that would be enticing to follow, and on the other hand, hoping that that enticement would eventually be effective.
That's fascinatingly similar but different in so many different ways. That's really interesting. I don't think I can think of anything. There is the kind of concept of the Arthurian quest, questing for something and riding through the wilderness, which probably didn't really happen in medieval Europe because it was so heavily settled that there really wasn't much wilderness in much of it. There was some parts. But you've got this landscape of these sort of traveling warrior priests kind of going to these frontier cities. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned poetry as well. Were they expected to be literate and sort of able to communicate beautifully and well? Is that part of the sort of troubadour, if you like, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the primary ways that you get a message out is through balagha, through eloquence. And there were various ideals of eloquent figures. I said warrior poet before, is something that you see recurring in these texts, particularly because you have archetypal figures like Antara ibn Shaddad. So Antara ibn Shaddad was an actual historical person before he became this legendized figure in literature. And there are two, therefore, bodies of work, one sort of by him and one sort of about him that integrates the literature by him. One of them is his own diwan, his own poetic output. Just to give you a sense of Antara's importance, even before the Abbasid period, when his epic gets sort of processed and promoted, he is said to have, in the pre-Islamic period, composed something called a mu'alaqa. Mu'alaqa literally means something that is hung. And it refers to a series of poems, each by a different author. There are 7 in some authors' estimations. There are 10 in others, by people from the pre-Islamic period who wrote such beautiful qasidas, wrote such beautiful odes, these multi-part odes that would go for hundreds of lines, basically. It's usually about 150, that the poems were cast in gold and hung in the Kaaba in Mecca. Because the Kaaba in Mecca, according to Muslim tradition, was said to have been constructed by the prophet Abraham or Ibrahim and his son Ismail or Ishmael, and been a shrine that at one point was therefore dedicated to monotheism, but by the time of Muhammad had been occupied increasingly by idolaters who put their own gods in that space. And Muhammad's tribe of Quraysh, into which he is born, is said to be sort of the, party that is the steward of this idolatrous shrine. And so Muhammad has to reconsecrate it to the traditions of Abraham, and he's sort of a restorer of monotheism in that space. And because poetry was considered to, in the pre-Islamic period, have a component of divine inspiration, almost like muses, it occupied that religious space alongside these idols if it was of sufficient caliber. So Anthar ibn Shaddad was of sufficient caliber, and that's one of the reasons that he's a hero. So being able, in other words, to versify, even though these epics aren't all in verse, they are a mixture of prose and poetry, being able to versify and having your poetry in these works was considered a mark of your heroism.
And you say they were cast in gold?
Allegedly.
Alleged. Oh, so we don't have them anymore, do we?
No.
Oh, no. I was going to say, what kind of things did they talk about? Do we have any examples?
Oh, no. Oh, so we have the actual poems. We don't have the physical cast in gold poems. But so Anzara ibn Shaddad, for example, talks about, he starts off with the question of, did poetry already die? He basically asks, is there anything more for somebody like me, this humble poet, to say? Which already tells you that there's a robust poetic tradition at hand, right? And he talks about his journeys and his battles. He talks about his love for his cousin, a woman named Abla. All this sort of stuff goes into his ode, because usually the Mu'allaqat had three parts. Part number one is often referred to as the Nasib, the amatory overture. It kind of often starts because it's a Bedouin poetic tradition, like a missed connections. I don't know if you remember those, but a sort of missed connections on Craigslist type of thing, where it's like, oh, I saw this beautiful girl, but my camp was over here and her camp was over there. And by the time that I returned to see her, all that was left were the atlal, the traces of her camp, because her party had already moved off to another oasis or whatever.
Right.
Missed connection.
Okay.
That impels the next part of the poem, called the rahil, the journey, where you get up on your camel, your horse, usually your camel, and you go off riding. Usually while you're on your ride, you also fit in a hunt, because you got to put dinner on the table by the evening, and you make your next camp. Then usually the poem ends with something called a gharad, which means its goal or its thrust. And the gharad is kind of a mixed bag, because sure, you had all of this buildup that was mostly about you and your love and your journey, but maybe you want to use that to adulate your tribe. Maybe you want to use that to show your reverence for a ruler. Actually, I wrote all of this for you. Maybe you want to use it to dispense some parting wisdom or hikmah about sort of the world and its affairs. Maybe you want to use it to talk about a specific historical event that otherwise would not get memorialized. So my point is basically that the Mu'allaqat, A, we still have them, and B, they show on the one hand a fealty to a sort of core tradition of these motifs, but on the other hand that people were using them to do very different things depending on who was talking and when.
Okay, so they were written in a fairly knowing way.
Yeah.
In that they were imagining an audience perhaps, and maybe a secondary audience. Maybe they're sort of writing epic poetry, but also acknowledging this was going to go to somebody political.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite complex, because sometimes then when you know that somebody's recording something with a view to it being read by a certain person, you have to interpret it slightly differently, because the context isn't just somebody writing a private diary where they can say whatever they like and they're not expecting anybody to read it. You've got the expectation that somebody's going to read it and judge it potentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is really fascinating. Are there any parts that are particularly striking, any details that you can remember offhand that are worth sharing? And how would somebody find this work? Obviously, if they're English speaking, are they translated and available?
Yeah, so the Mu'allaqat are translated by a few different people. Michael Sells has a wonderful volume called Desert Tracings, where he translates them. James Montgomery translates all of the poetry of Anthara ibn Shaddad in particular in a volume called War Songs. That translation was done through the Library of Arabic Literature, which is one of my favorite press outlets. It's a branch of NYU Press out of their Abu Dhabi campus. And it publishes bilingual editions, so you can see the Arabic, if you are Arabophone or want to be more Arabophone than you are, facing the English side by side. There's also a new edition of the Mu'allaqat that was a team-edited edition called Mu'allaqat for Millennials, which is sort of trying to promote these poems to the next generation, I guess. Um, but the epics themselves, in which things like, so Antar ibn Shaddad is a hero of his own epic, and he, until about the second volume, I think, might be even the third volume of his 8-volume epic in modern editions, has yet to compose his Mu'allaqah. So there's all this build up to him becoming the warrior poet that we know him to be today in his own story, legendized in this way. Those are much more spotty in terms of the translations that you can access because of that massive length. So that al-Himma is 5,000 pages, Antara is 4,000 pages. But people have tried. The first attempt to translate one of these epics into English was done in the early 1800s by, I forget his exact title, but it was something like the Oriental Emissary to the Ottoman Court from England, Tarek Hamilton.
Right.
He got a few volumes in. I don't think he actually completed the project for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
People have attempted since. So Harry Norris has a translation called The Adventures of Antar that looks just at the Yemeni and East African portions of the Sirah, where you can see Antara, whose mother was Abyssinian, sort of going to his putative homeland that he's never been to before and fighting there for souls and materiel and all these things that I've been talking about. There's Malcolm Lyon's 3-volume study called The Arabian Epic, where he gives synopses of all of these works. And most recently, much to my joy, there's actually a very heavily abridged translation by Melanie Magadow for Penguin Classics of The Tale of Princess Fatima, is how it got translated. And that deals with that Arabo-Byzantine Wars epic that I was talking about. That's the sort of backbone of my own book.
Okay, how wonderful. So there's a plethora of places people can look and try and work this out. Are there any controversies in the translations? One of the problems with translating poetry is sometimes poetry works differently in different languages, and there are metaphors and concepts that we don't understand that's really hard to translate. Is there anything like that that's worth pointing out briefly?
Yeah, so I guess the saying goes that translation is treachery from the Italian, and that is always, therefore, a thing that people battle over. One of the primary concerns, I guess you could say, is the dispute between the very academic version of translation, where it's, an attempt to capture the nuances of each word and you're doing the footnoting and you have the whole critical apparatus versus just translating poetry as poetry in a way that is readable and accessible. That's a philosophical difference on which I've tended to come down on the latter side. I try to translate the poetry that's in the siras in my book as poetically as possible to give you a sense of the world in which you are supposed to be experiencing it and how its emotional resonance is supposed to come across. The other thing that I sort of gesture to is just the question of how to translate concepts that became racialized in the early Islamic period in these works. So when a person is referred to as aswad or black versus when they're referred to as a hajin, which literally means somebody who is half or mixed, what are we supposed to be thinking about imagistically? What are we supposed to be thinking about historically and culturally when these words get used? And can we do so while creating a little bit of daylight between our current concepts of what blackness and mixedness are? Because as you could already see in my description of like the Bidayat Sudan, it doesn't map totally onto our modern concepts of blackness, while also still conveying how that was socially activated and how that was a category concept in these people's worlds.
Yes, it's really hard as a modern person with all the baggage that we inevitably carry from our own upbringings or our own society, trying to map that across directly to language, because you can read a word and you think, well, that's a bit harsh. And it is today, but back then, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it actually meant something totally different or didn't even have negative connotations whatsoever. Or sometimes it might have many more negative connotations than we expect. So, that's quite difficult. How do we try and unpick some of that then when we're actually studying some of these works? Is there a way of cross-referencing somehow?
Yeah, so that somewhat goes back to my point that I never really picked up on before about these concepts being on the one hand commonsensical in the sense of your experience of the visual and how you index, oh, like he's darker than me, he's lighter than me, but also genealogical. So one of the ways that I sort of get at the question of racialization and how can we study this historically is we think about the fact that race in our modern understanding is what some philosophers have called a covert construction, which is to say that it's something that we make as societies. We create these categories and fit people into them. But on the other hand, we ascribe these categories to causes that are superhuman, that are natural. We say, oh, no, I'm not as an individual creating the concept of blackness. It's there in the world. I can literally see that this person has a different skin tone than I do. So because it's a covert construction, this means that when people ascribe their category concepts of blackness and whiteness or anything in between to things, they don't describe them to social factors. They describe them to nature. They ascribe them to science. They ascribe them to physiology and human reproduction and kinship. So I look at all of those dimensions of what was the science of the time, what were the laws around family and reproduction, what were people's understandings of kinship structures, and situate blackness within that. So for example, I mentioned before that Antara ibn Shaddad is a hero who is half Abyssinian. His mother is an Abyssinian woman, and half Arab. His father is a chief in the tribe of Abs. In the pre-Islamic period, that would have marked him as a hejin, a term that's often translated as mongrel or half-caste, which is to say that it was derogatory then and is often translated in derogatory ways. It comes from animal husbandry. So a hejin, before it was used to describe people, was used to describe horses who had an Arabian father and a non-Arabian mother. So you can kind of see, okay, so there's a scientific component or there's a breeding component that's coming into this.
Not purebred kind of thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And so then you can see how that gets imputed into, oh, we can understand human difference in this way too. However, the idea of a hejin, that category, kind of falls away in the early Islamic period because there's a new legal construction that comes into play. Namely, the idea that, first of all, so Muslim men, I should say, can marry up to 4 women if they can treat them all equally. That is a right that is enshrined in the Quran. But in addition to that, there's also another type of female access to a Muslim man's household that can be had through something called milk al-yamin, or the possession of the right hand, which is to say concubinage structures. And Muslim men can take women who are concubines into their household. If you purchase a woman who is going to be a person to whom you then have sexual access, and you impregnate her, and she has a child, then according to Islamic law, at least in Sunni traditions, that woman becomes an walad, mother of the son or mother of the child. After she becomes an walad, she can neither be sold nor gifted away from the family, and she will be freed automatically upon her owner's death. The child, meanwhile, regardless of how he looks, so if you have an Abyssinian concubine, even if your child is born looking more like her than like you, and you, in the everyday commonsensical fashion, would say, oh, he's black, gets the father's nasab, which is to say that he has a claim on your patriline. He therefore, on paper, is ethnically Arab and ethnically affiliated with your tribe. So you have to, in other words, accommodate the fact that you're going to have kids who don't, quote unquote, look like they belong, who nonetheless have the bona fides on paper of full Arab belonging, and that is a concept of unilateral descent that is making them a pure Arab, quote unquote. So all that is to say, one of the things that I'm trying to get people to think about when they think about the history of blackness is, as you said, undoing this idea of baggage, undoing our relationship to things like the one drop rule, or undoing even our commonsensical, what do my eyes tell me, sort of relationship to blackness, and thinking much more about things like legal structures, things like reproductive models, things like how are people actually in situ as a social category, making this in society.
So effectively, the son of a slave concubine becomes full member of the tribe.
Yeah, full member with inheritance and naturalization, or whatever we might want to call that somewhat anachronistically. Yeah.
What about daughters? Is that covered?
Same.
The same?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, there are, because of daughters occupying just a different social space, there are a few accounts in the early Islamic period of fathers trying to sort of disclaim their daughters and saying, oh, no, she's not a legitimate child, I don't want her, kind of thing. That seems to have happened a bit more with female children than with male children. But at the same time, the fact that those are getting written down and the fact that they become lightning rod cases and precedents tells us that people were trying to militate against that. People wanted to say, no, the child is from, the family bed. You have to claim her. That's the way it is. And that becomes actually the sort of legal refrain that's used in those cases.
So this hero is from one of these social situations of,
yeah.
mother was a slave concubine, father was Arabic, And he becomes this famous, real historical person that then gets turned into a bit of a legend, presumably after his death. Hundreds of years after his death, or is it happening anyway?
Yeah, so Antara is an interesting figure because, as I said before, he's pre-Islamic. So he's before this law about the concubines. So his story ends up being used later on to sort of say, like, oh yeah, we were really crappy to people who were born of these types of relationship before.
Oh, right. So it was used as an example of how it was bad.
Yeah. And because he's such an important hero, this sort of legitimates the new legal paradigm, right?
Right.
Well, what if your son's an Antara ibn Shaddad and you didn't acknowledge him and you didn't put him in your family? How horrible would that be? The lag time between Antara's Sira, so his epic, starting to be attested, and his own lifetime is a lag time of about 6 centuries.
Oh, wow. So substantial.
So he was born in the 500s.
Right. Substantial time period. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking if it was just after his death, you'd have had people who knew him writing about him. But obviously, there's more than enough time for everybody to not have an actual clue.
Right.
Other than the stories they're told. Right. Okay.
Right. There's a few touchstones that lead up to him before then. So he's around in the 500s, dies in the late 500s. He has his poetry start to be written down in the, I believe, late 9th, early 10th century. And then it's another couple centuries hence before we start seeing, like, oh yeah, there's this epic called Sirat Antara ibn Shaddad. And we really only see it in this one autobiography by this guy who is Samuel al-Maghribi. He's a Jewish guy who converts to Islam. And he says, oh, when I was a little kid, talking about sort of his experience of being educated and coming into his realization of his Muslim piety. When I was a little kid, I used to read these stories about this guy named Antara ibn Shaddad and this woman named Dat al-Himma and her sidekick named Al-Battal. And then I grew up and read real history books. So you also get a sense of the entertainment value.
So they were already being they were already legend or fictionalized at this stage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what sort of happens to the stories? So how changed do they get? And does it get sort of obviously fiction? Or is it sort of one of those things where it's fictionalized but plausible? Or does it become crazy like, some legends do?
So it's a mix in the sense that there's absolutely some historical elements that you can pull from these stories if you know what to look for. But the primary way of recognizing their fictionality is, first of all, the timelines get really wonky and also very teleological. So in Antara's epic, it's said that, he was sent by God to Mahd al-Ard to ready the earth for the Prophet Muhammad. Well, he can't anticipate that. That has to be hindsight. And then that tells you also how the events are going to unfold along a certain format with these 3 empires that Muhammad also ended up being in a conversation with during his own political events in his lifetime. And also, there are figures that Antara ibn Shaddad meets and interacts with in the world of the story that are important to the time period in which he was active as a historical figure, but probably were not people that he would have ever been able to meet. So, for example, another Mu'alaqa author, another author of one of these famed hanging odes, this guy named Imrul Qais, who was a prince in the tribe of Kinda, or tribal federation, I should say, of Kinda, actually in the story meets with Antara ibn Shaddad. They have a contest of wit where they each recite as many synonyms for different Arabic words as they can think of, and then they part ways. And if that meeting did occur, first of all, which unlikely, it probably did not occur with a synonym off that everybody remembered all of the nuances of. So you can see sort of how the fish is getting bigger and bigger in this story. In Sirat al-Himma, the text that I work with the most, people just live extraordinarily long. If you were to actually live as long as the heroes in the story live, you would have lived about 130 to 150 years. So stretching the lifetime in order to integrate more of these figures so you can have these kinds of meetings. But then that sort of bends the plausibility a little bit.
Yeah, it's a fairly common kind of way of allowing people who you really want to meet in a story to actually meet.
Exactly.
The biblical tradition, the further back you go, the longer everybody lived. And I believe in ancient Egypt, it's the same if you trace the early kings or the early rulers lived extraordinarily long time periods. And it's sort of partly claiming the past, claiming data from the past, therefore, your bona fides as a nation, because they go back a lot further than you've got records for. Because if you quadruple somebody's reign a long, long time ago, who's going to complain? And it just goes back a lot further.
Right.
It's fascinating that different cultures have adopted the same kind of narrative fiction, if you like, to
Hmm.
make the stories work. So that's really talking about how this sort of pre-Islamic character was introduced. Does the flavor of his adventures and legend, does it shift with the rise of Islam itself? How does the Islamic world sort of absorb a pre-Islamic figure into its own mythologizing?
So the best way to put this goes back to that point that I made about his story and how he's introduced, where he's, said to ready the earth for Muhammad's coming, which is he kind of gets turned into what some scholars refer to as a proto-Muslim character, in the sense that Abdullah ibn Shaddad in his story never swears by pre-Islamic Arabian pantheon gods, for example. Instead, he only swears by God Almighty. So he has a sort of monotheistic disposition. He swears by the holy sites of Mecca, so he'll swear by the Kaaba or the well of Zamzam. The reason I'm emphasizing swearing is because oath taking was very important in the pre-Islamic period and in the Islamic period. There are parts of the Quran, for example, where one, before reciting a surah or a chapter, will open with swearing by the stars or swearing by the constellations and things like that. And it's to sort of gesture to your, on the one hand, personal commitments to what you're talking about, but also cosmic commitments or engagement with this wider transcendental space. And there is an increasing scholarly consensus that there was much more monotheism in pre-Islamic Arabia than previous scholars have granted, partly because one of the ways that the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic period, gets mythologized is as a space and time of idolatry, a space and time of pantheistic or polytheistic worship. But at the same time, there's also an Islamic figuration of what this means. So Muhammad is sometimes referred to before he begins receiving the revelations of the Quran as a Hanif, which is basically an expression that means somebody who had a monotheistic sensibility or intuition, even if they didn't actually live in a monotheistic religious space. So other prophets from the Hebrew Bible, for example, are sometimes also described in this way before the giving of the law.
Yes, and I've also heard of people talking about worthy pagans
Yes.
in the Christian tradition. There's certain kind of historical figures that through it wasn't their fault because they hadn't heard the word, and had they heard the word, they would have obviously understood it. But because they died beforehand, and we really want to claim them into our mythology,
Yeah.
and yeah, you can see how that kind of makes a lot of sense. What about the Crusades?
Mm.
How did that time in history shift and change things about this area? Because we haven't got much longer, and
Oh,
this
yeah.
is a vast topic, but I'm really interested in trying to bring it back a little bit to areas that my audience might have more experience of, which is the Western and the Crusades.
Yeah, absolutely. So some scholars, Malcolm Lyons, the guy who did that giant 3-volume study of the epics, say that the Crusades was actually an important period for the textualization, possibly, of these works, and that an entirely new sort of paradigm of and set of people with whom one is fighting might have actually sort of regalvanized the meaning of these types of stories. So there's that sort of ambient or more culturally informed understanding of where might the two seams have met. But there's also a textual footprint, not so much from the Bilad al-Ifranj, the lands of the Franks, but because of crusading endeavors having to basically cross through Byzantine territory, maybe there's a bit of a suture here. So one of the texts that Sirat al-Himma, the Arabo-Byzantine Wars text, is most often compared with is a Byzantine text called the Digenis Akratos. Akratos basically means a frontier warrior in much the same way as those Muhajirun and Mujahidun that I was talking about before. And Digenis means twain born or two blooded, depending on how you want to translate it. And it centers on a character who is the child of a Byzantine woman and a Saracen emir. So somebody who was from the Islamic world who had an interaction with this Byzantine woman on the frontier, a frontier that, of course, after things like the Battle of Manzikert, was particularly volatile, not just in the sense of its import for Byzantines, but also of its import for Latin Christendom as well and their understanding of what they were doing. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also the aspect of something that my colleague Cameron Cross researches, which is sort of romance and epic as a broad medieval genre. that became a vector for this type of heroic storytelling to inculcate the types of values that we've been talking about. And of course, the Western companion to that is often considered the chanson de geste. So things like the Song of Roland, which are emerging at a similar time. My favorite example, though, of the relationship between quote unquote crusade culture and the culture of the Siras is actually something about their historiography. How have people received them later on? There is a collector of African fables from the 19th and early 20th century US, Alfonso Orenzo Stafford, who became very interested, as many Black American authors did of his era, with Antar as a figure. And he said Antar was the hero of the Arabian version of the Iliad, and surely his story would have predated and been more circulated than any of the jests of the Italians or French from the 12th centuries. So he sort of uses the Black model of chivalry as he understands it as a Black American author and thinker to kind of vaunt this tradition of people of color being engaged in this type of chivalric model over the sort of crusading paradigm of like, oh, we're, white Christians fighting for white Christendom. And he's kind of using in this apologetic mode. So it's not just a question of the history of these stories, but also the history of the story's reception that I think is a really interesting way of understanding their relationship to the Crusades.
Yes. Do you think there's any kind of borrowing of each other's legends and sort of rewriting and going, you know what, that's a really good point. I'm going to rewrite my story with components of that slightly changed for my audience. Do you think there was sort of exchange of tall tales at all?
Yes and no. There is a very ambiguous and contested attestation of people knowing of the Antaria, the story of Antar, in Western Europe that Geraldine Heng has looked at. There is, however, I think more importantly than this, a strong sense of the impact visually of Muslim armies being as mixed as they would have appeared to Western European fighters. So in the Chanson de Roland, there's this line where it talks about the armies of the Saracen emir in, I think, Saragossa or wherever they are in Spain. And it talks about the fact that his army is composed of everything from like people who are Slavs to people who are Negre or Black to people who are basically indigenous North Africans. And it says that basically one of the things that makes the Saracens' army so formidable is not just its sheer size, but all the different corners of the earth from which it is pulled. And it's that recognition of that multiplicity that is also something that the Arabic epics are trying to help people grapple with and understand. Why elevate these Black heroes in the first place? Well, because you have an expanding vision for the Islamic world. You have this frontier outlook, and you want to be able to say that you're positioning the people who might become a part of your world, as diverse as they might be, or as different from you as they might be, to your ultimate strength, that your army is indeed becoming more formidable for this, that your society is indeed being bettered for this. So I think there's clearly a, if not sharing of stories, a shared instance of being struck by the implications of this.
I wonder how the sort of Frankish, or the West, the Christendom, which was presumably more ethnically homogenous, it must be quite not a shock exactly, but it must have been a very different, if you're used to fighting an army that looks like yourself, largely, that would be one thing. But then you see this huge army with different tactics, different armor, different dress, a mixture of different skin tones, notwithstanding the fact that you've heard legends of this vast empire that's potentially quite threatening. Must have been quite a psychological impact on soldiers of the time to see all these different people. When I was looking at the Mappa Mundi in Hereford, they talk, further away from the place that people know, the more sort of legendary and weird it gets. And it mentions the labyrinth of the Minotaur, and it mentions all sorts of weird things. But the further away you get, the more weird they get, because that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so encountering these armies of massive variation must have been quite a shock. I wonder how they adapted their tactics, because suddenly you've got these things you haven't fought before, and you see for the first time, and you wonder, are they real people even,
Yeah.
perhaps?
I mean, there's this amazing vignette that I look at in my book where Muslim storytellers try to imagine what the Byzantine reaction would have been, basically, to witnessing this. So you have this central hero in Sirat al-Himma who is Black, Abdul Wahab, And one of the things that happens is there's this other character, Abu Hazahiz. His name literally means father of convulsions, like earthquakes. So he's kind of, said to be this like gigantic black man with, all of the horrible stereotypes of like hyper-virile, hyper-masculine strength and whatever. But the Byzantines set their sights on him when they see him as somebody that they're about to make war with and say, oh, we should capture him because he looks like he could fight Abdul Wahab. So there's a fighting fire with fire mentality that the Muslims who are telling this story sort of impute to the Byzantine side, where it's just like, oh, they didn't really know what to do with our black soldiers, so they decided to just get their own.
Right. We want one of those, please.
Yeah,
so yeah.
Exactly. So there's
Wow.
this covetousness, this desire and this exoticization that you can see on the part of the Byzantines. But then, of course, you have to remember how much of that must have been projection, because one of the things that ends up being fulcrum of this particular portion of the story is that then Abdul Wahab captures Abu Hazahiz and then tries to convert him to Islam and get him back on the quote unquote right side, and uses various structures like that structure of, post-manumission clientage or wala that he would have used at the time in a legal sense to create this relationship of military tutelage and partnership with this man. So it's teaching you, in other words, if you're going to recruit a soldier like this, what are the social structures at hand through which you could even do so? And trying to create a persuasive narrative on multiple registers with that.
It's also interesting that they're not seeing somebody's skin tone as lesser or greater. They're seeing this person is immensely powerful. We want them on our side to fight this other immensely powerful person who does look a bit different to us, but is definitely powerful. There's no sense of superiority or inferiority based on ethnicity. There is on sort of ability to fight. I think that's really kind of interesting because it sort of shifts your idea that blackness wasn't seen as less or more. It was just different and could be mighty and might not be. But, these heroes were considered mighty heroes.
Yeah. I mean, that is very much the line that the text is walking, is not necessarily saying that Abu Hazahiz is automatically inferiorized because of his blackness, but rather sort of creating a sense that there's a bigger barrier to entry, both because implicitly, because he's black, he was trafficked into Islamic lands and then Byzantine ones and is not Muslim and has to be converted and all this sort of stuff. So there's this sense of, oh, this is like a lost soul, basically. And also because at some level, on the one hand, he's being portrayed as hyper masculine, he's being portrayed as more ignorant because of his lack of religion, but therefore as pliable and usable and useful. So I don't want to say necessarily he's being viewed as an equal, but rather that he has a clear use case.
Yeah, an opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. At the same time, though, we know sort of the dangers of articulating our relationships with other human beings in terms of use case. I mean, this is a, perfectly calibrated justification for things like military slavery, which Muslims did indeed practice.
Fascinating. All right, we've come roughly to the end of it. Is there anything we've missed out that you're burning to tell our listeners?
This was really fun. I don't think I have any other. I think you've sapped all of the thoughts from my head. So.
I'm sure I'll come up with other questions as soon as I finish this, but it was absolutely wonderful talking with you. I've learnt a lot, and I've also learnt some areas that I think I need to do a little bit of study, because there's a whole bunch of really interesting combat manuals. I think the Mamluks in particular have combat manuals, which I desperately want to try and find a translation of. So if anybody knows where they are, I would love that. Maybe you could send me an email if you do know. Because of my horse training, I'm particularly interested in how other people trained horses and fought on horseback. So it's Black Knights. Is the book available now?
Yes, it's available now wherever books are sold, or at least wherever academic books are sold. Amazon, it has it.
That's wonderful. And what about other social media? Are you followable on other places?
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. I'm really just on Blue Sky.
And what do we call it on Blue Sky, your handle?
I am at rachelschine.bsky.social. And I appear as Dr. Rachel Schine because I'm pretentious. So.
No, you're not. You've worked hard for it. You should tell people what you are. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.